In the winter of 1983, the London police responded to an unusual call. Human remains had been found at a house on Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, and it all started with a clogged drain. The property was a large house divided into several flats, and for some time, many of the tenants had been complaining about problems with one of the toilets and a strong odor coming from the area. A plumber was called, and the drain was quickly cleared. However, he had to return less than a week later when the same toilet became blocked again. This time, he decided to investigate more deeply. Because of the nature of his work, it was expected that he would encounter unpleasant smells, but he later stated that he had never seen anything like that before. He could barely stand to be in the bathroom, stopping several times to catch his breath from the stench. When he opened the access to the drain system, the smell almost knocked him backward. Inside the pipes, a large mass of flesh and bone was blocking most of the system. That, without a doubt, was what had caused the blockage. Within minutes, he realized they were human remains. Completely shocked, the man called the police. This happened on February 9, 1983, and soon a team of officers surrounded the area. Among the remains, investigators found a human hand, confirming the plumber's worst suspicions. They also discovered that the blockage extended beyond the ground floor, indicating that it started higher up in the building. The tenant of that upper flat was a 37-year-old man who worked nearby. His name was Dennis Nilsen. The remains were discovered in the morning, and the police decided to wait inside the property to avoid alerting the possible killer. They already knew the man had used the toilet to dispose of human remains, but many questions were still unanswered. The officers stayed hidden inside the house for about 3 hours, waiting for the suspect to arrive. When Dennis finally walked through the door, he was surprised and immediately detained by the police. He appeared shocked when they told him that human remains had been found in the drain, but his fake reaction did not last long. After some questioning, he led the officers to his room, where he pointed out several plastic bags containing more human remains. Inside Dennis's wardrobe, they found 2 severed heads, as well as bones and tissue scattered throughout the room. The odor was unbearable, and the forensic experts had difficulty remaining in the flat. Legs were found in drawers, and a skull and a pelvis were placed on a table. The forensic team managed to partially reconstruct 3 bodies using what was found in the room, all of them male. One of the forensic officers looked out the window and saw a large backyard. It took him only a few seconds to realize what the killer had done. The team went down to the garden, where they found even more fragments of bones and tissue. Dennis was arrested and taken to the police station. On the way, one of the officers asked how many bodies they were looking at, given the large amount of flesh found at the scene. The man replied that it was probably around 15. At the station, Dennis agreed to talk to the police, speaking to the officers as though they were old friends. Without any change in tone, he confessed that if he had not been arrested, he could have easily reached 150 victims. Without showing any remorse, he spent the next few hours recounting one of the most disturbing stories the detectives had ever heard. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945, in Fraserburgh, Scotland. He was described as a very introverted boy who displayed strange behavior, according to his own mother. Elizabeth rarely got the chance to hug her son, who always rejected her affection. He also made no friends at school and had great difficulty communicating. The only exception was his grandfather. The man filled the gap left by Dennis's father and was the only person who truly connected with him. They walked and fished together almost every day. One day, when Dennis came home from school, Elizabeth asked if he wanted to see his grandfather. The boy said yes, and she took him to the kitchen. There on the table was a coffin, and inside it, his grandfather. Dennis was not prepared to lose his only connection to the world, and it became a deeply traumatic event in his life. According to Dennis himself, from that day on, love and death became one and the same, something the world would only understand much later when the horrors inside his apartment came to light. Dennis was 6 years old at that time. In September 1961, at 16, Dennis enlisted in the British Army. He spent about 3 years training at the depot in Aldershot, an important military training centre in the United Kingdom. Later, he was assigned to the Army Catering Corps, the division responsible for feeding the troops. There, he worked as a cook and learned meat cutting and preparation techniques, skills that years later would be used in a very different context. The environment forced him to develop a certain level of interaction with his colleagues, and it was during this period that he discovered he was attracted to other men. In 1972, Dennis left the army and began police training, joining the Metropolitan Police and moving to London. Shortly after finishing his training and beginning to work, Dennis met David Painter, a 20-year-old man introduced by a co-worker. Painter agreed to go to Dennis's house, where, after drinking together, he fell asleep. When he woke up, he found out that Dennis had tried to photograph him while he was unconscious. Furious, Painter fought with Dennis and, in panic, jumped out of the third-floor window. He survived the fall but suffered serious injuries that required hospitalization. The police questioned Dennis about the incident, but he was released without formal charges. Painter's family did not want him to testify or be publicly exposed, partly out of fear of negative repercussions in a time when homosexuality still carried heavy stigma. After that, Dennis started drinking alone. He frequented gay bars and began having casual encounters with other men. He eventually quit the police and went to work as a public employee at the London Job Centre. After some time living that way, Dennis decided he wanted to leave behind the nightlife and the multiple casual relationships and instead share his life with just one person. The problem was, Dennis was never able to truly connect with anyone. He was extremely self-absorbed and showed little interest in others. He spent most of his life isolated and dependent on alcohol. On the rare occasions when he interacted with someone, that person was usually there to help operate the camera. Dennis did not do it for money or attention. He did it because he was obsessed with his own image. In 1975, Dennis met David Galichan, a 20-year-old man, at a pub in Camden Town, London. The two quickly began a relationship, and Nilsen believed he had finally found the love of his life. Shortly after that, David left the hostel where he was living and moved in with Dennis in a flat in Cricklewood. The place looked almost like ruins. The carpet was coming loose from the floor, the furniture was old, and pieces of the ceiling would fall on their own. However, they had private access to a garden. David was determined to turn the place into a home, but that didn't seem to be Dennis's main goal. After 18 months of renovations and constant fights, they broke up. David chose to leave Dennis and move out. This was another turning point in the life of the serial killer. He desperately sought companionship, but that kind of connection simply seemed impossible for him. Dennis invited one man after another, hoping one of them would stay, but he failed every time. His heavy drinking removed whatever restraint he still had, and that seemed to drive most of his companions away. Since the day he saw his grandfather's body on the table, Dennis had been fascinated by death. He started to create fantasies in his mind, the kind that, for people like him, usually end in terrible decisions. On New Year's Day, 1978, Dennis, then 33 years old, woke up next to a teenager he had met at a pub the night before. The young man made it clear that he was going to leave and started getting up. It was at that moment that something changed inside Dennis's mind. He could no longer bear the feeling of being abandoned by his partners, and he decided he wouldn't let the boy go. He grabbed a necktie that was nearby and wrapped it around the sleeping teenager's neck. As he tightened the knot, the boy woke up suddenly and fought desperately to break free. He kicked Dennis and tried to escape, but couldn't. When the young man lost consciousness, Dennis placed him in a chair, leaned his head back, and submerged it in a bucket of water. He was still alive, because Dennis could see air bubbles rising from his nose, but he no longer resisted. After a few minutes, the bubbles stopped. Dennis bathed, dried, and dressed the body. He moved it around the apartment several times, treating it like a mannequin. He talked to the corpse, stroked its hair, and acted as if it were still alive. He placed it next to him to watch TV, talking to it about his day. In that body, Dennis found a substitute for the companionship he craved. That macabre routine continued for about a week, until the advanced stage of decomposition made the fantasy impossible to maintain. He then placed the body under the floorboards, where it remained for 8 months. When the smell became unbearable, Dennis looked toward the garden. He dismembered the body and buried the parts in the backyard. Only in 2005 would this victim be identified as Stephen Dean Holmes, who was just 14 years old. Dennis had found a way to bring his dark fantasies to life, and he wouldn't stop. A few months later, Dennis met a Canadian tourist named Kenneth O'Kendon in a pub. After spending the day together, drinking and sightseeing, they went back to Dennis's apartment. Once again, consumed by the fear of being left alone, the killer strangled the man using the cord of a pair of headphones. Just like he had done with the first victim, he cleaned the body and repeated the same disturbing ritual. The next day, he placed the body inside a wardrobe, threw away the clothes, and went to work. When he returned home, he took photos of the corpse, committed acts of necrophilia, and then placed it under the floorboards. 5 months later, Dennis claimed his next victim. Martin Duffy, a 16-year-old boy from Worcestershire, had been living on the streets since arriving in London. Dennis invited him to spend the night at his home. He killed Martin in the same way as before, first strangling him, then drowning him. Dennis kept the body in his wardrobe for 2 weeks before placing it under the floorboards. On August 11, 1980, a young man named Douglas Stewart, a Scottish bartender, called the police to Dennis's address. The two had met at the Golden Lion pub in Soho and later went to Dennis's flat. Stewart said he fell asleep in an armchair and woke up with his feet tied, while Dennis tried to strangle him with a necktie. He managed to escape and waited for the police in front of the building. When the officers arrived, they noticed Stewart was drunk and went up to Dennis's apartment to hear his version. Dennis acted surprised by the accusations, and the police interpreted the situation as a misunderstanding during a consensual encounter. A report was made, but Stewart didn't follow through with the complaint, leaving the killer free once again. After that, Dennis murdered 5 more young men whose identities mostly remain unknown. Only one of them was ever identified, William Sutherland, a 26-year-old man known for frequenting bars around Cricklewood. Nilsen admitted that at first he couldn't remember the details, but later recalled that he had strangled him with his bare hands. On September 17, 1981, Dennis met Malcolm Barlow, a 23-year-old man, near his home. Malcolm suffered from epilepsy and had collapsed on the street after a seizure, so Dennis called an ambulance to help him. The next day, Malcolm was discharged from the hospital and went to Dennis's house to thank him for his kindness. Dennis invited him in for a few drinks. That same night, Malcolm was strangled and killed. Between 1978 and 1981, Dennis had already killed around 12 men. Most of them were homeless or marginalized young men. People few others would notice were missing, which made identification difficult. According to Dennis, during the crimes he would enter a sort of trance. He claimed that he managed to stop himself in time and release his victims on 7 occasions. Unfortunately, that was not the case for most of them. On November 23, 1981, Dennis's 36th birthday, he met a 19-year-old student named Paul Nobbs and took him to his apartment. They drank together and went to bed. Paul woke up around 2:30 a.m. with a severe headache. When he went to the kitchen, he looked in the mirror and saw a deep red mark on his neck, blood in the whites of his eyes, and bruises on his face. Dennis told him he didn't look good and should see a doctor. The same day, Paul went to see the university doctor, who told him that the marks on his neck were consistent with strangulation. The doctor advised him to go to the police, but Paul chose not to, fearing that his sexuality would be exposed. With so many bodies accumulated in his house, Dennis decided to get rid of them. He laid the corpses on the kitchen floor and dismembered them with a knife. Often, he boiled the skulls to remove the flesh and disposed of the internal organs in plastic bags. He buried the limbs in the garden and kept the torsos in suitcases until he could burn them in a bonfire at the corner of the yard. On several occasions, he spent days feeding that fire, and the neighbors never suspected that it was human remains. The following year, in 1982, Dennis tried to stop his behavior by moving to a top-floor flat at 23 Cranley Gardens in Muswell Hill, North London. This time, the place had no garden and no floorboards that could hide bodies. Dennis thought that, without places to hide them, he might be able to control his impulses. But that didn't happen. On February 2, 1983, he killed John Howlett, a 23-year-old man. After inviting him to his apartment, they drank and were intimate. Once again, Dennis didn't want the man to leave. He grabbed a piece of upholstery fabric and used it to strangle him. John fought back, trying to break free, but Dennis struck his head against the floor until he lost consciousness. When he noticed that John was still alive, Dennis wrapped the same upholstery fabric around his neck again and tightened it for another 2 or 3 minutes before submerging the body in water for the rest of the night. The following year, Dennis tried to kill a 21-year-old man named Carl Stotter, whom he met at a pub in Camden. After being invited to Dennis's home, Carl fell asleep inside a sleeping bag on the living room floor. At first, he thought Dennis was only adjusting the zipper of the bag during the night, but he soon lost consciousness. Later, he recalled hearing running water and realized that he had been placed in the bathtub while Dennis tried to drown him. Luckily, Carl survived the attempt. When Dennis realized that he was still alive, he carried him to his bed and lay beside him until he regained consciousness. When Carl woke up, Dennis told him that the zipper of the sleeping bag had accidentally caught on his neck. Carl went to the doctor, who confirmed that his condition was consistent with severe strangulation. He went to the police, but they didn't believe his story. Later that year, Dennis invited Archibald Graham Allen, a 27-year-old man, for a meal at his apartment before killing him and leaving the body in the bathtub for 3 days. Dennis found him on the street, trying to get a taxi but failing because he was heavily intoxicated. Dennis offered to take him home instead. He later told investigators that he kept the body seated on his couch for 2 days, and when he returned from work, he would sit beside it and watch TV. In 1983, Dennis killed his last victim, Stephen Sinclair, a 20-year-old man who struggled with drug addiction and wandered around Oxford Street. On January 26th, Sinclair was taken to Dennis's apartment, where he was strangled while under the effects of alcohol and drugs. After repeating his usual ritual, Dennis needed to dispose of the bodies of his last 3 victims. Since he no longer had access to an outdoor space, he resorted to boiling the heads, hands, and feet to remove the flesh and cutting the remains into small pieces, small enough to flush down the toilet or discard in plastic bags. That was what eventually clogged the building's plumbing. And on February 9, 1983, when Dennis returned from work, the person waiting for him wasn't one of his victims. It was the police. Nilsen was interrogated 16 times over the following months and provided detailed accounts of each of the 15 murders. Without remorse or hesitation, he accepted the fact that he had been caught and seemed almost unconcerned, as if he didn't believe he would have to pay for his actions. On November 4, 1983, Dennis Andrew Nilsen was found guilty of 15 counts of murder, along with charges of desecration and concealment of corpses. He was sentenced to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. Dennis's defense team tried multiple times to appeal or modify his sentence, but all attempts failed. Eventually, he was transferred to HM Prison Full Sutton in Yorkshire. He spent his days reading, writing, and exchanging letters with civilians and other inmates. On May 10, 2018, Dennis complained of severe abdominal pain and was taken to York Hospital. He was diagnosed with a ruptured abdominal aorta, underwent surgery, but died 2 days later at 72. The official cause of death was a pulmonary embolism caused by a retroperitoneal hemorrhage. His body was cremated in June 2018, with no family members present. Dennis Nilsen was a cold-blooded killer, defined by his emotional detachment and utter indifference toward human life. He preyed on society's most vulnerable, those who often went unseen, to satisfy his dark compulsions. Just as he had lived, Dennis died alone, a fitting end for a man who spent his entire life trying to escape his own loneliness. If this story stayed with you, please consider subscribing, hitting the like button, and letting us know in the comments which forgotten victims or overlooked cases deserve to be told next.